Why we love the Tang Dynasty, exploring the unique charm of what's seen by many as the greatest imperial dynasty in Chinese history. Episode 11, Tang Poetry Technique. In this episode, we'll be trying to understand the lives of the Tang poets, great and small, and learn how life was not always glamorous and successful. Sometimes it seems they had to wait centuries for fame and fortune. I'm Bob Jones, and in this podcast series, we'll be getting to know the Tang Dynasty and attempting to discover how, at its height, it became possibly the most powerful, interconnected, and innovative country in the world, with a rich and influential legacy that survives even to this day. These days, a poet will write a poem. They'll probably write it on a computer and maybe publish it online. The audiences may get an email or text to let them know that they've produced a new work, and will download it to read at their leisure on the subway or later at home. Maybe they will get 1 million likes on their social media page, be interviewed by the media, celebrated and recognized whenever they walk down the street, and, who knows, maybe even get rich. It's a very direct way of communication. Maybe there will be an editor who makes the poem ready for publication. Maybe there is a publisher who provides the platform for the poem. But of course, that was not the case during the Tang Dynasty. So, how did the average Tang poet create their works? And most importantly, how did they get it out to their eager public to enjoy? And did they ever achieve rock star status during their lifetimes? Let's take a poem by Li Bai as an example. Many Chinese people will instantly recognize this work and maybe even be able to recite it from memory. The moonlight in front of the bed is suspected to be frost on the ground. Looking up at the moon, looking down at your hometown. Now firstly, we are hearing this in translation, so that's already one disadvantage, but also there are actually several other versions of the same poem in existence, each slightly different, which alters the meaning. Why is this? Because all the way along there are different filters which have changed the intent of the work. You might have a copyist who makes copies of the poem to give to people to read. Maybe they changed a word along the way, or just misunderstood the meaning. Then again, you may find editors and publishers selecting or even altering the text to suit their needs. Finally, you might find that the reader interprets the work according to his or her own life experience. The point is, after so much time, and with so many intermediaries, how certain can we be that we are experiencing Li Bai's poem in the way he wanted us to, seeing the point he was trying to make and understanding the nuances of the piece? Tricky. One difficulty is that after more than 1,000 years, there is very little primary source material for us to see and touch. Even though by the Song Dynasty the publishing industry was getting into full swing, that was not the case during the time of the Tang. There was woodblock or engraving printing, but this was so expensive to do and cumbersome that it was only used to print Buddhist scriptures. And more often than not, mistakes crept into the poems because, as we mentioned, they passed through several hands. Then, of course, there is the passage of time. It's estimated that we still have 1,300 poems by Du Fu and 900 poems by Li Bai still in existence today. But how representative are these of the poet's work? What about the poems the poets wrote but never published, and those that have been lost along the way? Some the poet probably kept in his or her possession. What's known as the complete works of Du Fu is actually 90% made up of works written by Du Fu after the age of 40. Whatever he wrote before has long since been scattered to the four winds. Many of Li Bai's poems were entrusted to a fan called Wei Hao, who allegedly ran 900 miles to take possession of them to make a collection. Others were gathered by his uncle, and yet more fell into the hands of descendants, some of whom treasured them and some of whom didn't. So basically, we are very lucky to have any examples of the work of ancient poets at all. Very few poets at the time kept journals for later generations to explain how they wrote their works, why they used certain words, or why they rejected some lines that appeared in earlier drafts. But there were some who did it on their behalf. As we know, the Tang capital Chang'an was a big, exciting city which attracted scholars and students from across the known world. One of them was a Japanese monk, later known as Master Kung Hai. He had come to the Tang Dynasty with the simple aim of cataloguing as much Tang culture as possible and then taking it, lock, stock and barrel, back to Japan where it could be copied. After 20 or so years in Tang China, Master Kung Hai returned to Japan with a wealth of documents and, most crucially for us, a book called Wenjing Mi Fu Lun, which essentially is a book on how to write Tang poetry. In it, he reveals that jobbing poets, maybe not the big names, but anyone out for a fun night, used all sorts of crib sheets to create poetry, rhyming dictionaries, flashcards to suggest words, and guides to the correct sounds to use. Just like people today might go to bars and clubs to tell stories, jokes, or sing K-pop, so the people got together to read and perform poetry. Sort of open mic nights for Tang poets of all skill levels. In many ways, they acted almost as a chat room for poets. They could mix, swap ideas, and act as a mutual support network. Otherwise, there was no mechanism for them to meet. Consider this, if there were no telephones or social media, how did people like Li Bai and Du Fu manage to meet up? Both were frequently on the road, so how did they get their diaries to coincide? Maybe they didn't, but then again, maybe they would meet up thanks to events organized by mutual friends. Abe Nakamaro, the Japanese student who stayed to become a trusted confidant of Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, loved poetry and knew many of the significant poets of the time. But this still doesn't explain who our Tang poets were writing for. Family connections is crucial to the story. Wang Wei, for example, was born into a big, influential family. At the time, there were only about 5 big families in Chang'an, namely Cui, Lu, Wang, Li, and Zheng. Wang was related to 2 of them. What the big families liked, the high society of the Tang dynasty, so society more generally liked. They liked Wang Wei, who reputedly wrote poems well and melodically. It is said that he was a talented musician and a great painter. So, as an all-rounder, he was a fun person to invite to gatherings. Li Bai was less lucky when it came to connections, and yet he still managed to create a reputation and a fan base, albeit mainly long after his death. He wasn't everyone's cup of tea, and indeed some described him as brutal. He certainly rubbed a lot of scholars up the wrong way. and yet history has judged him to be a formidable poet and equal to the most connected and privileged of the day. Some say he had 5 important aims in his life: fame, travel, immortality, to make friends, and to drink. He was certainly very famous for the last one. Du Fu wrote a poem called The 8 Immortals of the Wine Cup, in which he told of a group of Tang Dynasty scholars, including Li Bai, who were very, very fond of their alcohol. Li Bai remained hopeful of fame all his life, but died in obscurity aged 61. So, what have we learnt about the poets of the Tang Dynasty and how they lived and worked? There weren't that many of them. Most worked in isolation. Some were lucky enough to have friends in high places or patrons who would fund and support them, introducing them to the right people. But equally, others were shunned by the nobility and would travel around in search of inspiration. Some resorted to books and cheat sheets to help them write for special occasions. Others, those which have stood the test of time, are little less than geniuses. Occasionally, they would meet each other or hold parties, perform for each other, and drink the night and day away. Special thanks go out to San Lien Zhongdu for their help in creating the content for this show. This is Bob Jones. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time.